Our final presenter today is Richard Ibarra. Richard has done the entire Southern California circuit. He received his BA in History and Medieval Studies from UCSB. His PhD in History from UCLA right here, and is currently a postdoc and teaching fellow at USC. His research focuses on the impact of transnational movement and early globalization on identity and the construction of community in the Iberian world during the long 16th century. He's currently completing a book on Genoese identity during in the 16th century Iberian Atlantic, following a group of Genoese merchant families from Genoa to Seville, and then to the Caribbean and Mexico. Material related to this project has appeared in the Journal of Medieval Iberian Studies and has been supported by a Frederick C. Lane dissertation grant from the Medieval Academy of America, as well as a Myers Fellowship from the Huntington Library. This latter fellowship is also supporting a second project on the group identity of Iberian bureaucrats. His presentation today draws on that new line of research, Iberian administration from Madrid to Manila, the case of Santiago de Vera, in the 16th century. Richard?
Thank you, Marie. Thank you, the organizers, for putting together such a lovely 2 days of discussions. I'm very honored to be a part of this and to present today something that I am thinking a lot about now, trying to develop this new sort of project. And the paper I'm presenting today starts with a case study. This one Iberian administrator, Dr. Santiago de Vera, and following his career, which took him across the world from Madrid to Mexico and Manila. And so this is one kind of register of local history, right, where we can maybe take this one individual and follow them to different places around the world, right? I wanted to try to take this opportunity, though, to think about global history in a slightly different way. So not just to think about his global movement, but to also think about the kinds of approaches that global history might be able to bring to figures like Santiago de Vera more broadly. So to me, this kind of mindset of global historians involves a broadening of perspectives on the past to investigate perhaps subjects that were not as much in traditional narratives, and to try to recover some of these stories. And as a result, we know a lot more about the medieval and early modern world and how it worked and the people within it. Now, that said, Iberian officials are not necessarily absent from a lot of these narratives, right? They are something, or a group that are nonetheless very present in this. And the understanding that we have of them, nonetheless, I would argue, can benefit from a different approach than the traditional one that is typically applied. So this group called Letrados, which is a kind of ambiguous, amorphous term, meaning generally to be lettered, which sometimes associated with university education and legal training, have long occupied this central place in explaining Iberian globalizing expansion, with whole chapters devoted to them. I should show there is a map, not a very fancy one, I apologize, but it does show, right, Santiago de Vera's trajectory. So they play this role, right, Letrados, in this kind of globalizing expansion, and they have whole chapters devoted to them in handbooks and surveys. But the focus is typically institutional and limited to those at the highest levels, with education in exclusive colleges in Spain's preeminent universities central to their identity. Their predominance in Iberian history is likewise associated with the state building of Isabel and Fernando, for example, right, at the very border between late medieval and early modern periods in Iberian history. They are thus often viewed within this kind of teleological expectations of bureaucratization that facilitates a rise of the West, or the emergence of early modernity, with deviations from that sort of Eurocentric pattern considered either a failure or perhaps a false start. So as it stands, I argue that we have been looking in a limited way at these administrators. And so this paper is a preliminary step towards a new project I'm developing to see the role of other aspects of their identity, a shared sense of struggle in the face of increasing competition for offices, shared views about Letrados' ideal emotional bearing or masculinity, or their interpersonal and especially familial ties that shaped and extended this shared letrado identity beyond the much studied role of university education. So different features of this letrado identity and how it is reproduced and how it operated on the ground to facilitate imperial administration across the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Pacific emerged as I approached the case of Vera, using some of the questions that are sort of grouped together, animating these, on the one hand, bodies and performance, but also the mobility and conversion research axes promoted by CMRS sex. Such an approach pushes against a traditional divide between medieval and early modern and reconsiders the aspects tied to bureaucratization in the traditional narrative of these developments. And I was very struck yesterday, I want to say, by Claire and Mohammed's presentations about certification of these sort of credentials and all of these figures. And I would very much look forward to continuing this conversation at a later point. So the extensive presence of family networks, for example, are seen as a sign of corruption, a failure of bureaucratization. However, when so much else about identity in the 16th century was relational and familial, perhaps that is actually the key to understanding letrado identity. Indeed, legislation tried to impose a separation between these jurists from the communities in which they serve to facilitate this impartiality. And so it is perhaps not surprising then that they would lean on and foster their own sort of family networks that might function externally to these other local networks, and thus infuriate local elites and others who wanted to be a part of this and would cry corruption. So just as intersectional studies demonstrate, drawing on the questions and methods of the body's performance research axis, I argue that we need to approach letrado identity as layered and relational, rather than focusing on a purported modernizing element of their group, this university education. And so bringing this perspective to Inquisition records, legal cases, literary texts, highlight a variety of aspects that contributed to the way letrados saw themselves and were seen by others beyond that education, bypassing perhaps that Eurocentric view of what makes a bureaucrat and distinguishes the medieval and early modern. Moreover, I cannot completely ignore Santiago de Vera's travel across the world either, right? And so there is this mobility conversion axis to focus attention on the high mobility of this group, requiring them to traverse the boundaries of the composite Iberian monarchies. And rather than stopping at cataloging the places that they go to, however, this aspect of their experience raises a different question to me. How did they manage the difficulties raised by movement and crossing boundaries, of being often perceived as outsiders in a world in which relations, networks, and roots were considered very important? Moving within this context where many were enamored with the idea of permanence, despite the fact that their worlds were rarely static. This paper takes the experience of the 16th century letrado Santiago de Vera as part of his network as a preliminary example to explore the possibilities of such an approach to this topic, bringing together manuscript and archival material from the Huntington Library, the Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico City, the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, and Madrid's notary records. So this preliminary example demonstrates how letrados mobilize a network of relatives and dependents who shared in this letrado identity and stress certain aspects beyond this university education in order to realize their vision of imperial order. So, to Santiago de Vera. Over a 38-year career spanning the end of the 16th century, Dr. Vera occupied a variety of offices ranging from civil and criminal judgeships to the presidency of appellate courts or audiencias. Vera came from a family with diverse professional backgrounds, but he primarily stressed that of his maternal relatives when discussing his family background to the Inquisition in Mexico City. Many of his uncles and cousins on his mother's side were letrados and occupied important offices, both within the Iberian Peninsula and across the Atlantic. Perhaps surprisingly then, scholarship on Dr. Vera does not specify where he had studied, nor does he himself mention his credentials in his preparatory statement concerning his limpieza de sangre. Included, however, in the Inquisition dossier is a copy of witness testimony taken in Madrid concerning his family's blood purity that he had sort of initiated before crossing the Atlantic and had the assistance of his father and brother during the 1550s. And here he is listed as a resident of none other than Salamanca. digging into the notarial records of Madrid and the registers of the University of Salamanca, I was able to confirm that Vera did indeed study law at the University of Salamanca, where he received his licentiate degree in law in 1559, but not his doctorate, which he will receive 20 years later, actually, in Mexico City. So his choice to study law may have relied on the support of his maternal relatives, since most of his siblings studied medicine or married others who had. This is not surprising given the prominent role of his father, Dr. Juan de Santiago, a court physician who had trained at the University of Alcalá de Henares, and indeed most of Vera's siblings would pursue that route instead. Although one sister, I should mention, married a notary in Madrid, and so there's potential letrado connection there. So such family ties may likewise have been helpful in securing posts. Nonetheless, after his graduation, which is often described in sources of the period as no mean feat. So gaining such an assignment from the Council of Castile was an especially grueling process. And Dr. Eugenio Salazar, another one of these letrados, and actually a distant maternal relative of Vera's, famously described this in a letter to his patron that later gets published, which is written ostensibly at the time when both he and Vera are looking for positions in 1560 at the court. So Salazar stated that the letrados waiting at court in hopeful expectation of an appointment, quote, take a road to wherever God might help them, and some, so others say, to where the devil would take them. This is how it is at court. Generally speaking, we are miserable, and we ask for miserable assignments, which they give us, and so we live miserably. End quote. And so apart from a possible shared educational experience, this mutual understanding, right, born through misery, experiencing this long process that they might undergo to receive an actual appointment after graduation, likewise contributed to a sense of letrado identity and solidarity, perhaps. This may have in turn been further reinforced by a general sense of embattlement. Despite the importance attributed to letrados, their reputation was somewhat more ambivalent in the 16th century. There were concerns that centered on tensions over the proper definition of masculinity, in a time increasingly perceived as one of crisis. The 17th century poet and playwright, for example, Francisco Quevedo, argued that the letrados constituted a plague on Spain, and quote, there is nothing here but letrados, perpetual locusts, would be better for Spain than so many degree holders. End quote. And likewise, Miguel de Cervantes in Don Quixote notes that the study of law diminished the number of those pursuing, right, the ideals of this nobility rooted in military prowess, and some might also associate this as a drift away from this drift away from military service to a focus on letters as perhaps indicative of a possibility of converso identity, those who had themselves converted from Judaism or Christianity, or those that may have descended from someone who had, right? The conflict between arms and letters and which form of masculinity should be privileged contributed to the ambivalence felt toward letrados. And Dr. Salazar's letter that I just mentioned before also demonstrates that animosity in his debate, that he describes occurring at court between a soldier and a letrado. And the soldier loudly expressed his disdain that letradillos and bachillerejos should be appointed over gentlemen soldiers or caballeros like himself, who had shed their blood for their king. He used the diminutive forms of letrado and bachiller to imply that they were lesser, perhaps even childlike, and a letrado present at the scene, perhaps not surprisingly, took offense at this and entered into a contest of wit with the soldier, who, Salazar says, was unable to keep up and thus attempted to, quote, supplement with his hands what he could not do with his tongue, unquote. So this contributed, I think, as well, right, to this shared group identity as diligent servants of the monarchy who could be trusted to embody royal order through a different form of masculinity that was not dependent on military service and posited a certain kind of emotional bearing. For example, Dr. Vera's nephew, Gaspar de Vera Medina, put together a defense after 6 months house arrest in 1604 in Mexico, where he had been accused of various abuses while serving as a regional magistrate in the district near the silver mines of Zacatecas, where he had been appointed by his uncle, Santiago de Vera. Tellingly, the accusations were framed around Medina's suitability as an official by questioning his possession of the traits that characterized a letrado. His accusers wrote that his temperament was so choleric that he would make a better soldier than an official, and that he played rather fast and loose with the law and had become wealthier than one could expect without some form of corruption. These claims thus tapped into the sense of opposition between military and lettered masculinity, and it was claimed that an appellate judge serving with his uncle chided him before this that even subordinate judges must behave as their superiors that are appointed to the appellate courts, serving as, quote, judges according to law rather than wings, to ensure that they do not do anything that could reflect badly on all of them, quote. So in the end, Gaspar was required to pay a substantial fine of 60,000 maravedís, and so he does this, and so it continues on. So Salazar also said in his letter that a hope for escape from the misery at court rested on letters sent to anyone and everyone who might be able to put in a word for him and secure an appointment. And indeed, this network of personal connections and family ties was central to forming and recreating letrado identity. To return to Santiago de Vera, he had several letrado relatives, right, that might have assisted him in securing a post, including his maternal uncle, Diego Lopez de Vera, who was a judge at the appellate courts of Granada and Valladolid. And this Diego Lopez de Vera's son, licentiate Francisco de Vera, who was the president of the appellate courts of Santo Domingo in the Caribbean and later in Panama. For a brief period in the early 1560s, Vera was appointed to serve as a regional judge, or alcalde mayor, in this town in northern Castile, Cangas de Tineo, where he had some complaints from locals and a negative audit by his successor that he appealed later to the Council of Castile. And I haven't been able to find yet what happens to him between that negative audit and his appeal, and then what happens to him later. But it seems that it worked out fine because he's eventually appointed as a judge to the appellate court in Santo Domingo in June of 1568, where his cousin Francisco de Vera was the president of the court. So Santiago de Vera continued to have run-ins with auditors, local elites, and some of his colleagues throughout his subsequent appointments. However, the general trajectory of his career is striking. Due to the consistent and continuous series of promotions that you can see here on the screen, and after a short suspension following an audit in Santo Domingo, for example, Rivera is allowed to take up his position as a judge of the appellate court of New Galicia, Mexico's northwest mining frontier, in 1573. He was then promoted to the more prestigious appellate court in New Spain in Mexico City, this time as a criminal judge, alcalde de crimen. And while in Mexico City, he took that opportunity to receive his doctorate in canon law from the University of Mexico in June of 1579, just as his relative Salazar later would in 1590. Vera maintained a relationship with the University of Mexico and was eventually elected as a rector and then promoted to the presidency until he was promoted to the presidency of a new appellate court established in Manila in 1583, which he was to establish alongside with two other judges. So the post came also with broader governing and military duties. And these additional duties, his relationship with his colleagues, which was a little bit more tense, and the state of the settlement at the time when he arrived, Manila had recently been burned, and tense relations with the region's indigenous population prompted Vera to maneuver for reassignment within the first few years. Although he requested to return to Castile with the position of one of the main administrative councils in Madrid, this was not granted. And when the appellate court in Manila was dissolved, Vera was instead assigned again to Mexico City's appellate court in 1588, but this time as a full judge. So it's still a decent position. In 1593, Vera was given his last promotion to the presidency of the Audiencia of New Galicia, where he had previously served in the early 1570s, and he would remain in that post until his death in 1609. So these positions or promotions were largely supported by the Council of the Indies in Madrid, which consistently ranked him among the top of those recommended for the posts that he received, describing him as an exemplary letrado who provided consistent royal service without complaint, or at least so the recommendation says, right? Since we do see there were a fair number of complaints. Throughout this series of appointments, Vera's approach on the ground was to extend his familial networks, often through marriages, even though he had complained about his own fellow judges in Manila for the marriages that they had secured for their relatives, to the children of local encomenderos. He nonetheless follows the same pattern. And this is most clearly seen not only in Manila, where he does this as well, but later when he is the president of the Audiencia New Galicia, his final posting. There, his son and daughter married two siblings of a prominent conquistador family living in Mexico City that had members of prestigious military orders and marriage ties to a viceroy, and their nephew would become a count. On a more local register, Vera also secured marriages to local conquistador families that lived in the sort of the regional capital and the location of the appellate court in New Galicia. So Vera's connections with these families would be used to facilitate economic pursuits, such as securing land grants from the audiencia that could be used for transhumant pasture. Vera's position could also contribute to these families' joint economic activities through special reductions of taxes on merchandise brought from Mexico City to supply the mines in Zacatecas, or perhaps also in the repartimiento of indigenous labor that was used for sugar production, and that is what his nephew Gaspar was doing when he gets all of these complaints against him as well. So in addition to these strategic marriages that connected Vera's family to the conquistador elite and provided an opening into their economic activities that could be reinforced by his role at the audiencia, Vera also consistently promoted relatives and retainers to local offices, these local judgeships, alcalde positions. And this created a network that was solidified by family ties and could provide him with information about the various parts of the region and strengthen the family's social and economic position. A complaint against Vera sent to Madrid in 1607 by a man named Jerónimo Conde, who was a local resident of Guadalajara, the regional capital, placed heavy stress on the cohesion of this network, which he argued excluded local elites. For Conde, this network centered on Vera's home and dinner table, where 9 of his children, in-laws, and grandchildren regularly ate alongside a group of around 37 retainers and relatives that had been drawn to Guadalajara from Castile, Peru, and elsewhere by Vera's appointment. The reasons for this approach were clear to Conde. In quote, "The great excess of this president, his greed in privileging his children and relatives so that they become rich before he leaves this territory, is rooted in his fear that tomorrow his tenure will end and he will either be dead or removed from office. As a result, he strives to ensure his children will be rich and prosperous, as they all are." Quote. However, this approach is also a key to the way that such letrados operated. It could be beneficial for their own family, to be sure, but it was also a method that could secure the cooperation of those in local offices and cultivate solidarity among the members of the audiencia who might otherwise be subject to fierce jockeying for prominence, in addition to facing the ambivalence of the local population. Such frictions led to several conflicts, apart from Conde's letter seeking an independent auditor or visitador to be sent to the audiencia. So again, Vera was not unfamiliar with the specter of a visit, and he had previously been investigated as an oidor at Santo Domingo in the 1570s, and was involved in Mexico City in the difficult sort of position in the 1580s, trying to subvert the visita being undertaken by the archbishop against the main oidores there in Mexico City, by requesting to review any witness testimony brought against the judges that were being investigated beforehand. Indeed, some of his relatives, again, like Gaspar de Vera, were investigated for their conduct in the offices they were assigned to by the audiencia during his presidency. Dr. Vera and his family's position also became precarious when his ancestors' past run-ins with the Inquisition in Seville started to come to light. Shortly before becoming the president of the Audiencia in Manila, Vera submitted a petition in 1583 to be named a consultant of the Inquisition in Mexico City, and proof of his blood purity or limpieza de sangre was pursued as a prerequisite. However, the inquisitors in Seville sent a letter explaining that their records identified his paternal grandparents and great-grandparents as conversos, who had been tried or either reconciled or burned by the Inquisition in Seville. Nevertheless, in the face of all of this, Vera's fellow letrados on the Council of the Suprema closed ranks, responding to the inquisitors in Mexico City who were questioning how they should proceed, given the damning letter from Seville. The Suprema in Madrid instructed that they should, quote, not meddle in this, end quote. That something like this should happen was indeed feared by Conde, although for a different reason. He also, in a later period, suspected that Vera's relative, Dr. Eugenio Salazar, who had followed a similar trajectory as Vera, but in the end secured a much more prominent position on the Council of the Indies in Madrid, would provide even greater protection should any complaints be made against Vera. Nonetheless, this is all, to me, a testament to the strength of this network within which Vera enmeshed himself. Right, that the visits and the other investigations, as well as the threat to his reputation that a controversial past might suggest, did not seriously inhibit his activities or those of his family. He remained in his posts. The potential ramifications of his proof of blood purity were halted, and he continued to be promoted to important posts thereafter. Despite Conde's complaint, he became such a fixture that the king refused his petition for retirement, requiring more substantial reasons than those he had already supplied regarding his health and mobility. So thus, Vera spent the end of his life pleading for permission to retire. Although in the end, perhaps it is unknowable whether he saw this as a benefit or a punishment. Thank you again for your kind attention.